If you close your eyes for a moment, you might feel it. A gentle breeze drifting across a world untouched by names or history, where mist clings to mountains and the sea hums an ancient melody. Imagine gliding over a chain of islands, just awakening from geological dreams, their valleys still carved by shifting earth and wandering rivers. No cities, no warriors, no stories yet. Only the soft rhythm of waves and the promise of a civilization waiting to happen. It is in this quiet cradle wrapped in ocean and time that the first people arrive, stepping into a landscape so vast and mysterious that even the mountains seem to pause and watch. And little do they know, they are laying the earliest threads of a story that will stretch across thousands of years. The Japanese archipelago in this era was a rugged sanctuary shaped by volcanic mountains, dense forests, and narrow coastal plains. Life here was not exactly convenient. A casual walk often involved hiking up steep slopes or navigating forests that seemed to whisper, "Good luck finding your way back." Yet this isolation became the land's quiet genius, guiding the growth of a culture that would evolve largely on its own terms. The sea both separated and sustained the people, offering abundant fish, and occasionally a reminder that boats must be built with more enthusiasm than guesswork. The earliest inhabitants arrived when land bridges still connected the islands to the Asian mainland. They carried stone tools, practical skills, and perhaps a healthy amount of optimism. Settling into small communities, they began shaping what we now call the Jōmon culture. Famous for their rope-patterned pottery, the Jōmon people created some of the world's oldest ceramic works. These pots likely served simple purposes: cooking, storing food, or impressing neighbors who visited and politely pretended not to be jealous. Their homes were pit dwellings dug partly into the earth for warmth and stability. Day-to-day life revolved around gathering nuts and berries, hunting deer and boar, and fishing along the coast. Their tools became increasingly refined as generations passed. Through these slow improvements, the Jōmon people didn't just survive, they cultivated a rhythm with the land. Communities gradually expanded and began trading across regions. Obsidian, shells, salt, and crafted goods traveled along early networks of exchange. With trade came subtle social organization. Certain individuals became skilled tool makers, hunters, or coordinators of community life. Though leadership was still simple and practical, these early patterns hinted at more complex social structures to come. As centuries unfolded, the relationship between people and environment deepened. They adapted to changing climates, shifting coastlines, and volcanic landscapes. Each adaptation added another layer to the cultural foundation forming beneath their feet. By the end of this long era, Japan was still far from the samurai age, but its essential character was already taking shape. A people connected to nature, communities building stability, tools and techniques steadily evolving. Quietly, patiently, the archipelago had begun to form its identity. And standing at this threshold, the stage was set for new migrations, new technologies, and the beginnings of political organization that would transform these early settlements into the roots of a remarkable civilization. The rise of agriculture and early power structures, 9th century BCE to 3rd century CE. If our story were a long, peaceful river, then this chapter is where the current quietly begins to shift. The islands, that had cradled the Jōmon people for millennia were about to welcome new travelers, new tools, and entirely new ideas about how life could be lived. The rhythm of hunting and gathering, once steady and comforting, prepared to make room for something more structured. And just like that, Japan's next great transformation began, not with thunder or war, but with small clusters of rice plants swaying politely in the breeze. Rice, as humble as it might seem, has a talent for changing civilizations. When new migrants arrived from the Asian mainland carrying seeds of wet rice agriculture, they unintentionally carried the blueprint for Japan's next social evolution. Picture a group of early farmers standing knee-deep in a muddy field, wondering if all this effort was truly better than collecting acorns in the forest. Over time, the answer proved to be yes. Rice brought stability, surplus, and the first real steps toward community organization on a larger scale. With rice paddies came irrigation channels, storage systems, and shared labor. Villages grew not simply as clusters of dwellings, but as coordinated societies, each person taking part in an expanding web of responsibilities. Instead of wandering the forests in search of food, people now woke to predictable mornings in fields shimmering with water and sky. And as always happens when humans settle down, complexity followed. Some became skilled at building channels, others managed crop distribution. A few were simply very good at pointing and explaining things loudly, which conveniently led to early notions of leadership. As these new agricultural communities formed, pottery styles evolved, tools became sharper, housing improved. Most importantly, a deeper sense of belonging emerged. The land itself, once a vast wild space, now felt more like a shared home shaped intentionally by human hands. And with stability came population growth. Families expanded, villages spread, knowledge multiplied. Bit by bit, the archipelago shifted from a world of wandering groups to one of rooted societies. Trade blossomed alongside these changes. Rivers acted as natural highways, carrying boats stacked with grains, pottery, polished tools, and occasionally a fisherman who insisted he knew a faster shortcut. Coastal villages exchanged seafood for inland goods. Mountain communities traded lumber for valuable obsidian. Though no written languages existed yet, these exchanges wove together a quiet, invisible map of interconnected communities. It is here that we meet the Yayoi period, named for the region where its pottery was first discovered. Yayoi pottery was simpler and plainer than the ornate Jōmon designs. While the Jōmon people clearly enjoyed decorating their ceramics with flair, the Yayoi approach said something closer to, let's just make it smooth. We have farming to do. Their focus shifted toward functionality, reflecting a lifestyle rooted in production, efficiency, and long-term settlement. With agricultural success came the need for stored resources. Roofed granaries raised on stilts appeared, protecting rice from moisture and hungry creatures. A full granary soon became a symbol of wealth and stability, and with wealth came influence. Over generations, this increased influence quietly matured into authority. Certain individuals or families gathered more resources, managed more land, or coordinated labor across larger regions. Leadership, once casual and cooperative, began to take on clearer structure. Inequality emerged gradually. Some households grew powerful, overseeing networks of smaller villages. As community ties strengthened, Identity shifted outward from family units to wider regional groups. The first whispers of political organization took form, not yet kingdoms but clusters of influence. These early leaders had no thrones or crowns. Their helmets were probably simple woven caps, and their weapons were forged not for ceremony but for protection and necessity. Yet their roles in shaping early governance were significant. Japan's connection with the mainland also deepened during this time. New forms of metallurgy arrived, transforming bronze and iron from curiosities into indispensable tools. Iron axes allowed forests to be cleared more efficiently. Bronze weapons made protection more effective. With stronger tools and weapons, communities expanded further, secured their borders, and defined their territories more distinctly. As territories grew, so did tensions. Competition for land, water, and resources likely sparked small conflicts. But these conflicts also prompted communities to unify under stronger leaders who could organize defenses and negotiate peace. Bit by bit, these groups began forming the seeds of early states. Chinese historical texts from the period later mention more than 100 small countries across the Japanese archipelago. These countries were not nations in the modern sense, but federations of villages under shared leadership. Despite the growing hierarchy, daily life for most people remained grounded in the simple rhythm of farming. Sunrise meant tending the fields. Midday invited gathering, weaving, shaping tools, or repairing homes. Evenings brought quiet meals, shared among family with stories told under fading light. Life was practical, cooperative, and tied intimately to the land. The emerging social structures did not erase the warmth of small community life. They simply added layers to it. The Yayoi era also introduced social rituals and gatherings that strengthened collective identity. Seasonal cycles dictated festivals celebrating planting, harvest, and transitions of weather. These occasions bonded villages and reinforced a shared sense of belonging. Though the spiritual content of these gatherings is beyond our scope here, the social effect is clear. They created community cohesion and marked the beginnings of cultural continuity. As centuries passed, burial practices became more elaborate. Early grave mounds appeared, some much larger than others, signaling clear distinctions in social status. Items placed with the deceased hinted at power and influence: bronze mirrors, iron weapons, fine beads. The first outlines of elite classes appeared in these silent monuments, rising from the landscape and foreshadowing the far more massive mounds that would come in the Kofun period. All these transformations point to one remarkable truth: Japan was evolving from a land of scattered villages into a mosaic of organized societies. Agriculture did not merely change how people ate, it changed how they lived, how they worked together, and how they understood leadership and community. The archipelago was no longer a place defined only by nature. It had become a place increasingly shaped by human intention. By the end of this era, powerful regional groups were forming. Trade, agriculture, social hierarchy, metallurgy, and early political structures converged to create a dynamic, interconnected world. And though no unified state existed yet, the foundations for one were quietly settling into place like stones in a future castle wall. As we step out of this chapter, the landscape of Japan looks very different from the world of Part 1. It is organized, productive, and complex, with communities that extend far beyond family lines. The stage is now prepared for a dramatic expansion of power, authority, and monumental construction. Ahead lies the emergence of ruling clans, massive tombs carved into earth, and the early sparks of the political order that will shape Japan for centuries to come. And so, gently and steadily, we drift toward the dawn of the Kofun Age. The Kofun Age and the emergence of early rulers, 3rd century, 538 CE. As the Yayoi world ripened into something more layered and interconnected, its people found themselves standing at the edge of yet another transformation. The archipelago had grown from a scatter of small communities into a collection of territories with leaders, alliances, and budding political structures. It was as if Japan had taken a long, deep breath during the Yayoi centuries, and now it was ready to exhale into a new age filled with ambition, organization, and an architectural flair that could be seen from miles away. The Kofun period was about to begin, and with it came the first truly grand expressions of leadership. Imagine the early 3rd century. The land is now dotted with farming settlements, strong regional chiefs, and clusters of influence that stretch farther than ever before. Trade has woven communities into delicate networks, metallurgy has sharpened tools and weapons alike, and social stratification has become more clearly visible through burial customs. All of these threads slowly knot together into something larger, the rise of powerful ruling clans. No longer satisfied with leading just a few villages, these emerging elites sought to organize entire regions, their voices rising above the rhythm of daily agricultural life. The archipelago, quietly but undeniably, was drifting toward centralized authority. One of the clearest signs of this change appeared in the landscape itself. For the first time in Japanese history, enormous earthen mounds began to rise, shaped with such deliberate form and staggering scale that they transformed the land into a canvas of political expression. These burial mounds, known today as kofun, were more than places of rest. They were declarations, monuments to authority. Silent, steadfast announcements that a new class of rulers now stood above the rest. The largest kofun stretched hundreds of meters in length, some shaped like colossal keyholes when viewed from above. Workers carved moats around them and raised their surfaces with layers of earth, stone, and labor that must have taken entire communities to complete. Imagine living in a village where your neighbor casually points toward a massive construction site and says, "We're helping build that for our chief. It's going to take years. Better pack a lunch." These monumental projects reveal more than architectural ambition. They signal the arrival of leaders who commanded enough authority to mobilize a workforce far beyond their immediate families. This centralization of labor hinted at something profound, the earliest form of statehood. These rulers were no longer simply strong individuals. They were proto-kings, organizing territories, commanding armies, and forming diplomatic ties across regions. The landscape of society shifted around these rulers. Local clans began absorbing smaller groups. Communities once independent gradually submitted to more powerful neighbors. Alliances formed, strengthened by trade, shared defense, or perhaps the subtle pressure of seeing a giant burial mound and thinking, maybe we don't want to upset the people who built that. These alliances were not always peaceful. Conflicts erupted over land, water rights, and succession disputes, pushing the archipelago into cycles of tension and consolidation that shaped the Kofun era's political climate. While the scale of leadership changed dramatically, the rhythm of daily life for most people remained tied to the land. Farmers tended their rice paddies with steady dedication. Craftsmen shaped tools, weapons, ornaments, and household goods with increasing technical skill. Traders carried goods along rivers and sea routes, deepening communication between distant regions. But hovering above this familiar world was a new layer of political authority. Chiefs became chieftains, and chieftains became sovereigns, shaping communities not just through influence but through governance. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Kofun era is the glimpse it provides into early military organization. Iron weapons grew more common. Armor plates, horse fittings, and helmets appeared in elite burials, suggesting that mounted warriors played an important role in asserting authority. It is tempting to imagine these early riders trotting through fields on horseback, embodying the earliest form of a warrior class. Though far removed from the samurai to come, these figures planted some of the ideological seeds that would later shape the martial spirit of Japan. Trade with the Asian mainland increased dramatically during this time. Warmer climates, expanded maritime skills, and stronger political structures made such connections easier. China and the Korean peninsula influenced the archipelago in profound ways. New technologies arrived: advanced iron production, new tools, improved weapons, weaving techniques, and methods of construction. Korean artisans brought expertise in crafting ornaments, mirrors, and ceremonial items that appeared in Kofun tombs. The exchange was not one-sided. Japan exported raw materials and crafted goods along maritime routes that grew busier with each passing decade. These interactions also shaped political development. As Japan gained exposure to more sophisticated state systems abroad, its own ruling clans began adopting more structured forms of governance. Territories became more defined. Communication networks expanded. Leaders began acting less like tribal chiefs and more like monarchs. And as consolidation continued, one region began to outshine the others. The Yamato polity emerged in central Japan as a dominant force. Through alliances, warfare, diplomacy, and strategic marriages, Yamato leadership gradually extended its influence over vast areas of the archipelago. Their authority was far from absolute, but their reach was undeniable. They coordinated labor for large kofun, organized trade networks, controlled key agricultural territories, and commanded significant military forces. In this era, Yamato rulers began shaping an identity that blended political power with cultural distinction. They employed symbols of authority such as bronze mirrors, elaborate swords, and fine ornaments. Their burial mounds grew increasingly monumental. They established distant administrative posts and formed alliances with powerful local clans, creating an early version of a unified political structure. The everyday person living under Yamato influence would have felt the shift gradually, maybe through new tax expectations, new leadership protocols, or the arrival of envoys carrying messages from distant rulers. Maybe through changes in weapon design or new craft styles brought from the mainland. Maybe through hearing stories told around communal fires, stories about powerful leaders far away who commanded armies and built hills for their dead that touched the sky. Though the Yamato polity did not unify all of Japan, its growing presence laid the groundwork for a future centralized state. Its political strategies, its cultural symbols, and its ability to mobilize labor influenced centuries of Japanese governance. Meanwhile, life continued to evolve on the ground. Communities grew larger, villages became towns, Towns became regional centers. Craft specialization deepened, with artisans who worked in wood, metal, or textiles producing increasingly refined goods. Farming expanded with improved tools. Social classes solidified into elites, commoners, and laborers, whose contributions shaped the era's economic foundation. The Kofun period gradually moved toward its close as new technologies and ideas flowed into the archipelago. Among these influences was the introduction of writing systems, advanced political doctrines, and new cultural practices that would reshape governance and society. Though this transformation belongs to the next chapter of our journey, its early seeds were already planted during this era of monumental tombs and emerging rulers. As we leave the Kofun age behind, the land of Japan no longer resembles the world of the first settlers. Its society is structured, its leadership is defined, its territories are organized, its rulers are recognized through symbols, armies, and monumental architecture that still stands today in silent testimony. The archipelago has taken its first real steps towards state formation. Its systems of authority, alliance, and identity now stretch across regions, and with the arrival of new cultural currents from abroad, Japan is poised to enter a period of political codification, artistic refinement, and deeper centralization. And so gently we drift forward into the dawn of the Yamato state and the early formation of Japan's imperial identity. Rise of the Yamato state and the foundations of central authority, 4th to 7th century CE. As the monumental Kofun continued rising from the earth like silent giants, the archipelago found itself drifting into an age of increasing order and consolidation. The rulers who commissioned those massive mounds were no longer merely powerful chiefs. They were becoming something more defined, more coordinated, and far more ambitious. Their influence now flowed across valleys and plains, threading distant communities into a fragile but growing tapestry of shared rule. And at the center of this emerging fabric stood the Yamato polity, ready to transform a loose collection of regional powers into the earliest form of centralized authority Japan had ever seen. Imagine the early 4th century. The land is still dominated by agricultural life, yet something is different. Envoys move between distant territories carrying messages wrapped carefully in cloth. Artisans create bronze mirrors with such precision they could almost be mistaken for modern metalwork. Warriors clad in iron armor practice formations that look remarkably organized for a world still learning how to coordinate across vast spaces. And beneath all of this activity lies the Yamato ambition, growing quietly but steadily. The Yamato rulers did not rise through sheer force alone. They understood the delicate art of alliances. One might say they had a talent for diplomacy long before diplomatic protocol existed. Their strategy blended marriage agreements, gift exchanges, military support, and a keen sense of timing. If a local clan was strong, Yamato sought partnership. If a clan was divided, Yamato offered protection. And if a clan was troublesome, Yamato arrived with iron weapons and the firm suggestion that cooperation was, in fact, an excellent idea. Through these layered relationships, the Yamato court extended its reach across much of central and western Japan. Each alliance strengthened the notion that authority could flow from a central source. In time, this developed into the earliest version of a Japanese state. Not fully unified, not yet rigidly defined, but undeniably present. While political alliances grew, so did cultural sophistication. Trade with the Korean Peninsula and China intensified, bringing advanced technologies, new craft techniques, and a wealth of ideas. Ironworking improved dramatically. Construction methods evolved. Artisans refined their skills in wood, lacquer, and textile production. This influx of knowledge created a foundation upon which Yamato leaders built their legitimacy. One of the most transformative imports of this era was writing. Chinese characters began making their way into Japan through artisans, scholars, and scribes who traveled across the sea. For a society that had long transmitted knowledge orally, the arrival of writing opened a new horizon. Official records, diplomatic messages, and genealogies could now be preserved more accurately. Rulers quickly understood the value of documentation, and scribes found themselves busier than ever, perhaps quietly wishing someone had warned them that paperwork could travel across oceans too. Through the gradual adoption of writing, the Yamato rulers gained the ability to formalize their authority. Their lineage, which they claimed stretched back through myth and antiquity, became a tool of political cohesion. Whether people believed every detail of these genealogies mattered less than the fact that the Yamato court was building a story, one that cast them not merely as powerful leaders, but as rightful ones. As political structure grew more refined, labor organization expanded as well. Large-scale projects such as irrigation networks, roads, and fortifications required coordinated effort. The Yamato court began appointing administrators to oversee distant territories. These early officials monitored resources, mediated local disputes, and ensured that the flow of goods, tribute, and loyalty continued smoothly. In return, regional leaders received recognition and privileges that reinforced their own status. This blend of centralized direction and regional autonomy allowed Yamato authority to spread without dissolving the local cultural diversity that defined the archipelago. Each region maintained its customs, dialects, and traditions, but all became loosely tied to the Yamato center through networks of obligation and shared identity. Meanwhile, the Kofun themselves grew only larger. They expanded into monumental expressions of power, complete with burial goods that reflected the wealth and craftsmanship of the era. Some were decorated with clay figures, haniwa, placed along the mound's edges like gentle guardians watching over the sleeping leader below. These figures depicted warriors, farmers, dancers, animals, and even houses. Through them, we glimpse a world of daily life, captured not in writing but in clay, each one offering a window into a society balancing order, creativity, and reverence. While such tombs signaled authority at home, equally important transformations were occurring in Japan's relationships abroad. Diplomatic missions traveled to the Korean Peninsula and China, returning with new knowledge about political systems, administrative organization, and cultural practices. The Yamato court studied these examples carefully. They saw how written law codes, standardized ranks, and formal bureaucracies strengthened kingdoms much larger than their own, and with each passing generation, the idea of modeling governance after continental systems grew more appealing. This continental influence would eventually blossom into full-scale reform, but its seeds were planted in this period, quietly tucked into the minds of scholars and leaders who imagined a more structured state. For now, Yamato authority operated through flexible networks of alliances, supported by the prestige of its rulers, the symbolism of its tombs, and the practicality of its administrative reach. Among the most important developments during this era was the increasing prominence of queens and female leaders. Early Chinese records mention a figure known as Himiko, a ruler from the archipelago who governed through diplomacy and martial alliances. While historians continue to debate which region she ruled, her presence in recorded history shows that women played significant political roles in early Japan, shaping both internal governance and external diplomacy. Powerful women would continue to influence the political landscape through this era, weaving themselves into the story of Yamato authority. As the 6th century approached, new waves of knowledge arrived from the mainland. Advanced metallurgy, new architectural techniques, fast improving agricultural practices, and new forms of social organization all entered Japan through envoys, scholars, and skilled migrants. Each innovation enriched the Yamato state and pushed it toward even more sophisticated governance. To manage this expanding world, the Yamato rulers established ranking systems that distributed titles, duties, and privileges among the elite clans. These ranks helped regulate the relationships between the central court and its supporting families. Though simple at first, these hierarchies gradually evolved into an administrative structure that coordinated decision-making across large territories. The Yamato court also began hosting more formal gatherings where leaders from across the archipelago presented tribute, exchanged information, and reaffirmed their alliances. These gatherings not only reinforced political unity but also allowed cultural exchange. Stories, songs, clothing styles, and craft techniques traveled with these leaders, creating a growing sense of shared identity across communities that had once been isolated. While political and social structures expanded, so too did artistic expression. Metalworkers crafted elaborate ornaments, weavers produced fine fabrics with intricate patterns, potters refined both functional and ceremonial designs. Woodworkers carved statues and objects that blended continental influence with local tradition. Each craft grew more sophisticated as regional techniques influenced one another. As the 6th century progressed, the Yamato state matured into a more confident and coordinated political entity. Its rulers commanded armies, organized infrastructure, and cultivated diplomatic relations abroad. They shaped cultural identity through monumental architecture, storytelling, and ritual performance. Their ambition grew with each generation, fueled by the knowledge that they now governed a land more connected, more productive, and more organized than ever before. And just as the archipelago itself seemed ready to step into a new level of unity, a tremendous wave of ideas and systems from the Korean Peninsula and China arrived that would reshape Japan's political foundations entirely. Concepts of legal codes, structured bureaucracies, continental-style capitals, and written governance began to flow into the Yamato court. The society that had started as scattered villages had grown into a cohesive entity with leaders capable of shaping large-scale reform. The next transformation would not be one of simple expansion, but of reinvention. Japan was poised to model its statecraft on continental systems, transforming itself into a structured, centralized government with institutions that would define centuries of its history. And so, with the quiet confidence of a nation ready for something new, we drift into the dawn of sweeping political reform and the birth of classical Japanese statehood. Reform, reorganization, and the shaping of a centralized state. 645 to 794 CE. The Yamato court, strengthened by centuries of alliances, diplomacy, and strategic leadership, now stood at a turning point. The world around them was changing quickly. The Korean peninsula buzzed with cultural exchanges. China, through its dynasties, displayed a model of governance so sophisticated that it resembled a vast, carefully tuned instrument. And Japan, watching from across the sea, felt a pull toward refinement that could no longer be ignored. If the early Yamato state was a foundation stone, then this new era would be the architectural blueprint layered atop it, guiding Japan toward a more structured political identity. The story of this transformation begins not with a peaceful decision, but with a dramatic shift within the Yamato court itself. Power struggles had simmered beneath the surface for years, and although the details could fill volumes, the essence is simple. The court realized it needed a more stable, unified system to prevent internal competition from destabilizing the central authority it had worked so hard to build. And so reform took shape, bold and sweeping, as if the entire nation exhaled and said, "All right then, let's get organized properly this time." Among the most defining changes were the Taika reforms, a series of political and administrative adjustments intending to restructure Japanese governance from the ground up. The reforms were inspired by China's Tang dynasty system, which was admired for its bureaucratic clarity and impressive efficiency. Japan did not copy these systems blindly. Instead, the court observed, considered, and adapted, shaping a uniquely Japanese version of continental governance. The Taika reforms declared that all land ultimately belonged to the state. This may have been a bit surprising for local clans who had grown rather fond of the territory they managed. Nevertheless, the idea was simple. If the land belonged to the state, then the court could manage taxation, organize labor, and assign administrative duties more effectively. In practice, this meant recording who lived where, who farmed which fields, and who owed what to the central government. And so Japan embarked on its first large-scale census. It likely took a great deal of patience, long walks between villages, and many explanations along the lines of, "No, we're not taking your goats. We just need to know you have them." Local administrators known as Kuni no Miyatsuko and later governed under more standardized titles were expected to uphold state policies, collect taxes, and maintain order. This shift helped transform Japan from a loose network of allied clans into a more coordinated administrative structure. As governance evolved, so did the court's presentation of authority. New ranking systems were introduced to regulate aristocratic status. Officials received titles reflecting their expertise and duties. This ranking system resembled a ladder that one could climb through merit, loyalty, or skill, though certainly a bit of family reputation did not hurt. The ranks created a sense of order within the elite class and supported a bureaucracy capable of administering an increasingly complex society. The influence of continental culture did not stop at administration. Architecture began to reflect new ideas. Palaces were designed with more structured layouts. Carpentry techniques improved. Elegant decorative styles traveled across the sea, bringing motifs of clouds, waves, and natural patterns that blended effortlessly with Japan's artistic sensibilities. One of the most symbolic steps in Japan's transformation was the establishment of a more formalized capital. Although capitals had shifted before, This era saw the deliberate shaping of cities modeled after Chinese urban planning, complete with grid layouts and designated administrative zones. Imagine planners standing over large wooden maps, moving pebbles to represent buildings, and feeling very satisfied when everything aligned neatly with the compass directions. These new capitals reflected a cultural awakening as well. Writing became increasingly important, and scholars refined their understanding of Chinese characters. The ability to read and write was no longer a simple skill. It became a gateway to political influence, diplomacy, and intellectual discourse. Scribes, poets, and thinkers found themselves at the heart of the court's cultural development. Literature began to flourish. Poetry gatherings became common among the elite, offering a stage for gentle competition in elegance. One can imagine noblemen sitting beneath blossoming trees, composing lines about dew on grass or the yearning of distant hearts, occasionally sneaking glances to see if anyone else was impressed. Through these poems, linguistic identity began to take shape, setting the foundation for future literary traditions that would define Japanese culture for centuries. During this era, the court also refined its diplomatic outreach. Japanese envoys traveled to China to study government, architecture, literature, and technologies. Some stayed for years, absorbing ideas that they would later weave into Japanese systems. Upon returning home, they often carried scrolls, books, models of tools, and quite possibly a sense of exhaustion from learning so many new things at once. Within Japan, the aristocratic class expanded its intellectual reach. New schools were established to train future officials. Scholars studied government codes, historical texts, and legal structures, laying the intellectual groundwork for a mature state. Governance shifted from intuitive leadership to documented procedure. This transition marked a profound cultural step forward. Japan was beginning to see itself as a nation shaped not only by lineage and alliances, but also by knowledge, structure, and conscious planning. Of course, these reforms did not simply roll out smoothly across the nation. Local clans, accustomed to their autonomy, sometimes resisted. Officials occasionally struggled to enforce policies over distant territories. Communication could be slow, weather unpredictable, and record-keeping a challenging art. Still, the momentum of reform carried forward, supported by generations of leaders who believed that Japan's future required structure, unity, and adaptation. One of the most significant architectural and political achievements of this era was the establishment of Nara as the first true permanent capital. With wide avenues, administrative buildings, and ceremonial halls, Nara stood as a testament to state organization. Its design echoed continental capitals while maintaining a distinctly Japanese spirit. The city became the center of governance, culture, and administration, pulling the archipelago into its orbit with a gravitational force that shaped the next era of political life. In this organized environment, taxation systems grew more precise. Farmers contributed rice, cloth, and labor to support state functions. Artisans produced tools, ornamentation, and ceremonial goods that reflected the growing complexity of the aristocratic lifestyle. Markets expanded as trade routes deepened, allowing goods to flow across regions with increasing regularity. As decades passed, governance improved through trial and refinement. Leaders evaluated which continental practices suited the archipelago and which did not. New law codes were developed, influenced by Chinese models but adapted to Japan's unique social landscape. administrative positions became more specialized. Communication between the capital and distant provinces grew more efficient, though perhaps still subject to occasional delays when messengers encountered storms, landslides, or overly curious deer. By the 8th century, the state's administrative framework had matured. The Japanese court now oversaw territory with a clarity far beyond earlier eras. Local governance operated through clearly defined districts. Aristocrats moved through structured ranks. Record-keeping became essential. For the first time, large-scale historical chronicles could be compiled, capturing the stories of rulers, clans, and the founding of the nation. These chronicles were more than historical accounts. They were instruments of identity, weaving myth, memory, and narrative into a cohesive national story. Villages became more efficient, and surplus production supported larger populations. As people settled into steady rhythms of work and community life, the state gained the stability needed for further cultural development. While reform strengthened governance, it also deepened court culture. Poetry, music, philosophy, and craftsmanship flourished under aristocratic patronage. Ritual practices shaped ceremonies that brought structure to political life. The capital became a center of sophistication, drawing thinkers, artisans, and leaders from across the realm. As the 8th century drew to a close, a profound cultural identity had begun to crystallize. Japan was transforming into a centralized, literate, and administratively coherent state. Its rulers governed through both lineage and structured authority. Its officials served through codified ranks. Its literature began to define an emerging national voice. Its capital embodied the ambitions of a society looking both inward to its roots and outward to new horizons. And so, as the Nara period approached its end, Japan stood ready for another transformation. Administration had been strengthened, diplomacy refined, and cultural expression elevated. What awaited next was an era of extraordinary artistic depth, political elegance, and literary beauty that would shape the soul of the nation. Gently and naturally, the story carries us toward the dawn of the Heian Age. The Heian court and the blossoming of aristocratic culture, 794 to 1180 CE. As the Nara period eased gently into twilight, a new dawn stirred in the heart of Japan. Leaders of the time felt the country needed a fresh beginning, one crafted with elegance, stability, and perhaps a bit more breathing room away from the influences that had accumulated in Nara. And so, in 794, a bold decision was made. The capital would move to a new location, one chosen with careful attention to geography, symbolism, and political necessity. This new city was called Heian Kyo, later known as Kyoto, and with its founding, Japan stepped into one of the most refined, poetic, and artistically vibrant eras in its history. Heian Kyo was designed like a dream given architectural form. Wide, orderly avenues stretched out in a grid. Gentle streams ran through quiet districts. Palaces gleamed beneath sunlight, their wooden pillars standing proudly like guardians of a new age. Scholars admired how the city aligned with continental models while still embracing the subtle beauty of Japan's natural surroundings. The capital felt both grand and serene, as if the land itself approved of this fresh beginning. With the move to Heian came a shift in the spirit of governance. While political reforms of earlier centuries laid the structural foundation, the Heian court brought refinement. Aristocrats, scholars, poets, and courtiers gathered in palaces decorated with sliding screens, painted scrolls, and elegant lacquerware. The air inside these halls often carried the scent of incense, the soft rustle of silk robes, and the gentle murmur of poetic conversation. It was a world where beauty became a language of its own, shaping how people spoke, dressed, wrote, and even thought. The Heian aristocracy cultivated a lifestyle that prized subtle emotion and artistic sensitivity. A courtier could gain admiration not through displays of power, but through the way he crafted a poem about the moon's reflection on water, or how gracefully he arranged a branch of plum blossoms in his room. Letters were written with exquisite care, folded with specific techniques, and often scented so thoroughly that the fragrance itself became a message. Even the color combinations of layered garments held meaning, shifting with the seasons like living paintings. But beneath this serene surface, political dynamics continued to stir. The imperial family reigned at the center of the court, yet real power often flowed around them in shifting patterns. One of the most influential forces in this dance was the Fujiwara clan, whose members masterfully intertwined their family with the imperial line through carefully arranged marriages. Over generations, they positioned themselves as royal advisors, regents, and guardians of the throne. Their subtle yet pervasive influence turned governance into a delicate performance, one where political skill often involved quiet persuasion rather than dramatic assertion. Despite the aristocratic elegance of the capital, daily life outside the court took on very different forms. Villages continued their rhythms of planting and harvesting. Local leaders managed regional affairs, ensuring supplies, labor, and taxes reached the capital as expected. Far from the incense-filled chambers of Heian, farmers listened to the rustle of rice fields rather than poetry gatherings, and blacksmiths shaped tools that kept communities running. The contrast between the refined world of the court and the practical realities of rural life created a fascinating duality within Japanese society. Yet even in the countryside, the reach of Heian culture slowly expanded. Craftsmen learned new techniques that filtered outward from the capital. Rituals and celebrations adopted Heian-influenced styles. Folk tales evolved into more polished narratives. Aesthetic appreciation, even if simpler than courtly standards, spread quietly into everyday life. The archipelago was beginning to share a cultural heartbeat that pulsed outward from Heian. One of the most defining features of the era was the blossoming of literature. The Heian court treasured words, and through this love, some of the most remarkable writings in Japanese history emerged. Poetry gatherings, diaries, and personal correspondence served romance, longing, humor, and observation with remarkable clarity, as vessels for deep emotion and reflection. Women of the court, in particular, played extraordinary roles as authors, capturing the subtleties of. Their writings opened windows into courtly life that no political document could ever convey. Through them, we see late-night conversations in candlelit rooms, secret glances exchanged behind screens, and the gentle sadness of seasons passing. The delicacy of human feeling became a legitimate subject worthy of artistic exploration. In this era of heightened sensitivity, the court discovered that everyday experiences could become art simply by being described with care. As literary expression flourished, so did the arts. Music drifted through palace corridors, played on instruments whose tones felt like ripples of silk across water. Dancers performed with gestures refined over generations. Painters created scenes of mountains, flowers, mist, and elegant figures. Calligraphers practiced strokes until a single line held both discipline and emotion. The Heian court lived in a world where nearly everything carried artistic weight, shaped by a desire to capture fleeting beauty before it vanished. Amid these cultural developments, Japan's political structure continued evolving. The central government, though sophisticated, gradually struggled to manage distant provinces effectively. The Heian court's focus on aesthetics sometimes diverted attention from the practicalities of local governance. Clans in the countryside gained prominence as they protected farmlands, managed resources, and commanded small military forces. These regional clans were not yet the fearsome warriors of later centuries, but their importance grew steadily, nurtured by necessity. The capital, meanwhile, remained a center of ceremony and refinement. Aristocrats tracked the seasons with devotion, observing changes in flowers, weather, and celestial patterns. Festivals filled the calendar, each one offering opportunities to display poetic talent or fashionable attire. Seasonal shifts were so important that many courtiers felt emotionally anchored to the subtle changes in color, temperature, or wind. If a breeze carried the scent of wisteria, one might write 3 poems about it before lunch. This heightened sensitivity shaped interpersonal relationships as well. Court romances often unfolded through layers of poetry and symbolism. A single phrase could carry worlds of meaning. A well-timed letter might shift the course of a relationship. Love was treated not as a bold declaration, but as a graceful dance, navigated with care, nuance, and an understanding of emotional etiquette. People of the Heian court lived in a world where feelings were expressed quietly yet profoundly. However, as decades turned into centuries, cracks began to appear in the elegant facade. Economic strain, disputes among powerful families, and the challenge of managing distant regions created instability. Local clans armed themselves to defend their lands, gradually forming early military groups. Though the Heian court remained the center of culture, its political authority slowly eroded from the edges inward. The rise of these regional warrior families set the stage for a profound social shift. They learned to manage conflicts, negotiate alliances, and assert influence through force when necessary. With time, these warriors would grow into a class entirely distinct from the aristocracy of Heian Kyo. Their emergence did not immediately disrupt the capital's culture, but their presence signaled a coming transformation that no amount of poetry could soften. Still, the Heian era remained radiant in its creative output. Even as political stability wavered, cultural expression continued to flourish. The capital seemed to exist within a glass bubble of refined beauty, its people devoted to capturing emotions, seasons, and aesthetics in ever more delicate forms. The Heian world was one of elegance, sensitivity, and artistic mastery. Its contributions would echo across centuries, shaping Japan's cultural identity long after its political influence faded. By the late 12th century, however, tension reached its peak. Warrior clans who had quietly gained power now began stepping boldly into political struggles. The capital felt the tremors of shifting authority. Alliances formed and dissolved. Families maneuvered for power, sensing that a new kind of leadership was rising. The Heian court, with all its elegance, found itself standing at the edge of a new age defined not by lyricism, but by the clang of weapons. As this graceful chapter draws to a close, we leave Heian Kyo shimmering in twilight, its beauty undiminished, its artistic legacy secure. But the tide is shifting. Beyond the capital's refined gardens and quiet halls, warriors are gathering, lands are being fortified, and political storms are beginning to form. Gently and inevitably, the story carries us toward an age of conflict, courage, and transformation. Next comes the rise of the samurai. The Genpei conflict and the birth of the samurai government, 1180 to 1192 CE. If the Heian court was a world of fluttering silk sleeves and poems drifting through candlelit rooms, then the final decades of its rule felt like a quiet tremor beneath a polished floor. For generations, aristocrats had shaped their identities through delicacy, grace, and subtle intelligence. Yet outside the capital's soft glow, a very different force was rising. In the provinces, steel glinted where ink once dominated, and horses carried messages faster than any court courier. A new kind of leader was emerging, shaped not by poetic sensitivity, but by resolve, responsibility, and the unmistakable weight of armor. And in the years ahead, these warriors would redefine the entire nation. The story begins in the late 12th century, when political tensions had stretched just thin enough to tremble at the slightest touch. The Heian court struggled to manage the shifting tides of power, and influential warrior families sensed opportunity. Two of the greatest clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, stood poised like opposing waves, each swelling with growing ambitions. Their rivalry had been building quietly for decades, shaped by small confrontations, uneasy alliances, and the restless pressure of Japan's changing social landscape. For a time, the Taira clan, led by the formidable Taira no Kiyomori, held dominance over the capital. Kiyomori placed allies in key government positions, secured imperial marriages for his family, and navigated political waters with the confidence of a man who believed he had solved the puzzle of ruling Heian Kyo. Yet power gained too quickly often breeds resistance, and whispers of discontent drifted through the corridors of the capital. Aristocrats murmured, warriors exchanged glances, and the Minamoto clan, though once suppressed, began gathering strength beyond the elegant city's reach. When conflict finally erupted in 1180, it did not begin with a grand battle, but with a plea. A young imperial prince, seeking to escape Taira dominance, called upon the Minamoto clan for support. That single moment cracked the fragile balance that had held Japan together. Like a stone dropped into still water, it sent ripples across the entire archipelago, drawing warriors, villages, and provinces into what would become the Genpei War. The Minamoto brothers, particularly Minamoto no Yoritomo, rose to answer the call. Yoritomo had spent years in distant exile, quietly surviving, waiting, learning. When his moment came, he stepped into leadership with calm certainty, gathering loyal warriors and forging alliances that stretched far beyond his remote stronghold. His approach was not impulsive. He moved with patience, building his power step by steady step, letting trust form as naturally as rivers find the sea. In contrast, the Taira forces operated closer to the capital, navigating political complexity while struggling to maintain control over a conflict spreading far beyond their familiar environment. As battles unfolded across mountains, rivers, and coastlines, the war transformed into a sweeping contest of strategy, endurance, and shifting loyalties. Warriors rode through forests where wind whispered across tall grasses. Ships clashed on waters that shimmered like quiet mirrors before erupting into chaos. Each clash, each choice, and each retreat carried Japan closer to a turning point. Through these years of conflict, the nature of power in Japan continued to shift. The Heian court watched from behind screens and polished floors, its influence fading like ink left too long in sunlight. Aristocrats whispered anxiously, sensing that their era was nearing its end. Even poetry gatherings carried notes of uncertainty, as if the moon itself hesitated to rise over such unsettled times. Meanwhile, the Minamoto clan grew stronger. Yoritomo understood that victory required more than battle prowess. It required structure, discipline, and a way to bind warriors through loyalty rather than mere necessity. From his base in Kamakura, far to the east of elegant Heian, he began shaping a new form of authority. He built networks of vassals, appointed stewards to oversee lands, and established clear expectations for military service. These early systems were the roots of something entirely new in Japanese history, though at the time, they appeared simply as pragmatic measures taken during wartime. As the war reached its later stages, Minamoto forces gained the advantage. The Taira, driven from the capital, retreated westward, escorting the young emperor whom they had placed on the throne. Battles continued across rivers and shorelines, until finally culminating in the famous naval clash at Danura in 1185. On that day, waves rose and fell beneath ships, heavy with warriors. Banners snapped sharply in the wind, and the sea became the silent witness to the end of an age. When the Taira were defeated, the political landscape of Japan shifted irreversibly. The Heian court, though still present, no longer held the power it once wielded. The Minamoto clan had emerged not only as victors, but as the leading force capable of redefining leadership across the archipelago. Yet Yoritomo, ever cautious, did not rush to claim titles or symbols. He moved carefully, recognizing that stability required legitimacy and structure, not simply victory. From his base in Kamakura, Yoritomo established systems that solidified warrior authority. He appointed military governors tasked with maintaining order in the provinces. He created stewards responsible for land and resources. These roles formalized the relationship between warriors and the central government, weaving together a new framework of governance built upon duty, loyalty, and service. By 1192, Yoritomo achieved recognition as the first shogun, a title that crystallized his authority and acknowledged the reality of Japan's transformed political world. The shogunate did not abolish the emperor or the court. Instead, it coexisted alongside them, forming a dual structure where ceremonial authority rested in Kyoto, while practical governance flowed from Kamakura. This arrangement allowed the warrior class to guide the country's direction while still respecting the symbolic significance of the imperial line. This new system marked the beginning of the Kamakura Shogunate and signaled Japan's shift toward leadership rooted in military responsibility rather than aristocratic elegance. The samurai, once regional guardians, now stood at the heart of national governance. Their values of duty, honor, and discipline slowly began shaping Japanese culture in ways the Heian court could never have anticipated. Yet the transition was not abrupt or harsh. It felt more like a quiet turning of the seasons. The Heian world, with all its beauty and refinement, did not vanish. Its literature, art, and sensitivity continued to influence generations. But now another layer had been added to Japan's identity, one forged in the grit of battlefields and the resolve of warriors who had risen to protect lands, families, and honor. As Yoritomo's new government settled into its structure, Japan found itself standing at the threshold of a new age. The capital, once the unquestioned center of political life, now shared its authority with a fortified city far to the east. Warriors became administrators, leaders, and guardians of the nation. Villages adjusted to new systems of governance. The archipelago's heartbeat shifted subtly, carrying the rhythm of hooves, armor, and steadfast determination. As we leave this chapter, the Heian world glows behind us like a fading lantern, while ahead lies the dawning of an era defined not by poets in silk, but by warriors in armor. And so gently, we drift into the age of the samurai. The Kamakura Shogunate and the shaping of the samurai order, 1192 to 1333 CE. When the Genpei War settled into silence and the beating of war drums faded into memory, Japan found itself breathing a different kind of air. It felt steadier, more grounded, as if the land itself recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now appointed as shogun, had not simply won a conflict. He had opened the doors to a new age, one guided by discipline, loyalty, and the steady composure of the warrior class. If the Heian era had been a long, poetic sigh, then the Kamakura period was the hum of a sword being sharpened at dawn. Kamakura, the new seat of power, was unlike the elegant chambers of Kyoto. Nestled between forested hills and the sea, it carried a rugged simplicity that seemed to welcome the samurai spirit. There were no sprawling palaces with painted screens or lavish poetry gatherings drifting late into the night. Instead, Kamakura pulsed with the energy of a place where decisions were made quickly. Horses were always ready, and everyone understood that life required equal measures of vigilance and humility. The capital of warriors was built not to impress, but to endure. Under Yoritomo's leadership, the foundations of the samurai government took form. His most significant achievement was creating a network of officials who acted as his eyes and ears throughout the provinces. Military governors were appointed to maintain order, prevent rebellion, and ensure that local warriors remained loyal to the shogunate. Estate stewards managed lands, monitored taxes, and supervised justice. These positions, while practical, carried immense influence, for they linked the power of Kamakura to the everyday lives of people across the country. This administrative structure created a delicate balance that Japan had never seen before. Authority was no longer anchored exclusively in Kyoto's courtly grace, nor was it scattered among independent clans. Instead, it flowed between two centers: the emperor, who symbolized divine continuity, and the shogun, who managed the realities of governance. This dual system required careful dance steps. Kyoto remained the cultural heart, whispering poetry into the nation's soul, while Kamakura became the firm hand guiding its actions. The samurai for the first time stepped fully into the role of governing class. Their values grew not only from combat but from duty, restraint, and integrity. They lived with the awareness that their responsibilities extended far beyond personal honor. A warrior might settle land disputes, mediate conflicts between villages, protect travelers from bandits, or ensure that communities could harvest their rice in peace. In many ways, samurai authority wove itself quietly into the rhythms of daily life across Japan. Yet even with newfound stability, the Kamakura Shogunate faced challenges that tested its resilience. The Minamoto line did not remain in power for long. After Yoritomo's death, political tensions rose within the shogunate. Power gradually shifted into the hands of the Hojo clan, who served as regents. Though the Hojo never claimed the title of shogun, they governed with firm control, shaping policy through councils and consultations. Their leadership style was cautious, steady, and surprisingly collective. Instead of one dominant figure barking orders, decisions often emerged from group deliberation, like waves gently agreeing on which shore to meet. The Hojo regents introduced legal reforms to bring clarity to samurai conduct. The legal code they produced emphasized fairness, responsibility, and practical solutions. It was not a philosophical document meant to inspire reflection, but a clear guide for resolving disputes efficiently. Under this code, justice became something measurable, rooted in precedent and balanced expectation. The samurai, for whom personal honor was everything, now had a formal structure through which conflicts could be addressed with professional integrity. This legal sensibility strengthened Kamakura's authority and helped maintain unity across the provinces. Even small villages learned to navigate the new system, understanding that their grievances could be carried upward through channels that felt more reliable than the scattered traditions of earlier eras. In a subtle but profound way, law became one of the shogunate's greatest tools for stability. However, the greatest test of the Kamakura government arrived not from within but from far across the sea. In the 13th century, powerful winds carried warnings from the Mongol Empire, which stretched across continents with formidable strength. The Mongols sent envoys demanding submission from Japan. Their message was clear, their expectations confident. Yet Japan, guided by its warrior leadership, refused. What followed were two Mongol invasion attempts in 1274 and again in 1281. The battles that erupted along the shores of northern Kyushu were unlike anything the samurai had ever faced. The Mongol army used strategies unfamiliar to Japanese warriors. Explosive projectiles burst through the air. Drums thundered to command troops. Coordination between cavalry and infantry moved with unsettling precision. For the samurai, who valued individual bravery and decisive duels, the Mongol approach felt as alien as fighting a storm. And yet, storms became Japan's unlikely ally. In both invasion attempts, violent typhoons swept through the invading fleets, destroying ships and scattering forces. These winds, later called kamikaze or divine winds, protected Japan from what might have been catastrophic defeat. Though luck and nature played their part, the resilience and courage of the samurai defending their shores became a defining memory. The invasions left Japan with a deepened sense of unity, and a recognition that vigilance was not simply a political necessity, but a national duty. Despite surviving these assaults, the economic strain of war burdened the shogunate. Samurai who had fought bravely expected rewards, yet little land could be given. The tension between duty and compensation grew heavier, pulling at the seams of the warrior system. Meanwhile, political factions within Kamakura and Kyoto continued their complex dance, gradually stirring discord that neither poetry nor law could soothe. By the early 14th century, cracks began to widen. Discontent grew among warriors and aristocrats alike. Ambitious leaders whispered about restoring the emperor to full power. Regional clans, sensing opportunity, questioned the shogunate's authority. The fragile balance that had held for generations wavered. When Emperor Go-Daigo launched a bold attempt to reclaim political control, the archipelago once again found itself swept into conflict. Warriors divided into factions, some supporting the emperor, others rallying behind the shogunate. Battles erupted, alliances shifted like clouds, and Kamakura's once steady governance trembled under the weight of uncertainty. In 1333, after years of mounting tension, the Kamakura Shogunate fell. Its collapse marked the end of Japan's first warrior government. Samurai leadership fractured, and new power centers struggled to emerge. The nation drifted into a period of reorganization, prepared for another great transformation. Yet the legacy of the Kamakura era endured far beyond its political lifespan. The legal systems it established shaped Japanese governance for centuries. The samurai ethos, refined through war and responsibility, became the backbone of a social identity that would define Japanese culture. The dual structure of imperial and military authority left an imprint that future governments would adapt again and again. As we leave the Kamakura period, we look back at a world that traded silk screens for armor, poems for legal codes, and graceful ceremonies for strategic councils. It was a world defined by resilience, by clarity, by purpose. A world that understood beauty not only in delicate gestures, but also in disciplined resolve. Ahead lies another era shaped by warriors, ambition, and shifting power. An age where order will be challenged, authority tested, and the nation reshaped once again. And so, softly, we drift into the next unfolding chapter. The rise of the Ashikaga and the tumult of the Muromachi age. The Muromachi era and the fracturing of power, 1336 to 1467 CE. When the Kamakura Shogunate fell, it left behind an echo that lingered across the archipelago, like the aftersound of a struck bell. The structure that had shaped the samurai world for more than a century dissolved into uncertainty, and for a moment Japan seemed suspended between what had been and what was yet to come. But history rarely allows long pauses. A new wave of ambition soon rose, carried by the determined figure of Ashikaga Takauji, who stepped into the shifting landscape with a confidence that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Takauji had originally sided with Emperor Go-Daigo in the effort to overthrow the Kamakura Shogunate, but as alliances twisted and expectations clashed, Takauji realized that he and the emperor imagined very different futures for Japan. Their disagreement soon grew into open conflict, pulling the country into a complex struggle. When Takauji ultimately established his own government in Kyoto, the Muromachi Shogunate was born, named after the district where its headquarters stood. Unlike the rugged Kamakura, Muromachi's power center sat close to the imperial palace, creating a dynamic relationship that blended proximity with political tension. The early Muromachi era felt like the world was adjusting to a new rhythm. Kyoto, still shimmering with the cultural legacy of the Heian court, now found itself hosting warrior governance. Samurai rode through streets once reserved for elegant processions. Administrative decisions echoed through halls, decorated with painted screens. The blend of aristocratic refinement and military practicality created a unique atmosphere, one where tea bowls and armor might very well be polished in the same afternoon. The Ashikaga rulers tried to balance their authority with a sense of cultural patronage. They supported the arts, encouraged craftsmanship, and built connections with temples, institutions, and intellectual circles. Under their influence, Japanese aesthetics evolved in new directions. A preference for simplicity, asymmetry, and quiet elegance began to take shape. Gardens transformed into living meditations, with moss, rocks, and carefully placed trees, inviting contemplation rather than awe. This era planted the seeds of Japanese artistic philosophies that would flourish for centuries. But beneath these refined developments, trouble simmered. The real challenge facing the Muromachi Shogunate was not artistic vision or courtly alliances, but the growing power of regional warlords. Throughout the provinces, military governors appointed during the Kamakura era had gained authority, resources, and influence. They controlled land, collected taxes, commanded local samurai, and often acted with increasing independence. Their loyalty to Kyoto sometimes depended on convenience rather than conviction. As generations passed, these regional powers began to act more like semi-independent rulers. Some governed responsibly, maintaining peace and prosperity in their territories. Others embraced ambition, expanding their influence and challenging neighbors. Slowly, the network that held the provincial lords together began to loosen, and the authority of the shogunate felt more symbolic than solid. The Ashikaga shoguns themselves occasionally struggled to assert consistent leadership. While some were strong and decisive, others found the political landscape too tangled to manage. In Kyoto, factions within the court, warrior families, and temples all vied for influence, turning governance into a delicate balancing act. The shogunate's authority depended on cooperation among key players, and when relationships grew strained, instability followed. Despite these complexities, the Muromachi period produced an extraordinary cultural bloom. Zen-inspired arts flourished. The tea tradition evolved into a meditative practice that celebrated tranquility in each deliberate movement. No theater emerged as a refined performance art, combining minimalist staging with profound emotional depth. Painters created monochrome ink landscapes that captured mountains, rivers, and trees with a single sweeping stroke. This was an era where creativity thrived, even as political unity grew increasingly fragile. Yet fragility rarely remains hidden. Tensions eventually rose to the surface, pulled by competing ambitions and generations of unresolved disputes. As influential clans maneuvered for advantage, the delicate balance within Kyoto began to crack. The throne and the shogunate occasionally aligned, occasionally clashed, and often endured uncomfortable coexistence. Regional lords, watching from afar, sensed the shifting momentum. By the mid-15th century, trouble materialized more tangibly. The shogunate's authority had weakened, provincial lords acted independently, and competition for influence reached a breaking point. The spark that ignited the coming storm was deceptively simple: a dispute over succession within the shogunate. But this small spark fell into a landscape already dry with tension. One side supported the shogun's chosen successor, another backed an alternative candidate. These opposing factions drew in powerful samurai families, imperial courtiers, and provincial warlords. Kyoto, once a city of poetry and elegance, soon became the center of a conflict that would reshape Japan entirely. This conflict became known as the Onin War, though war hardly captures the chaotic, drawn-out nature of what unfolded. Rather than a single decisive clash, it devolved into a prolonged struggle marked by sieges, fires, shifting alliances, and exhausted negotiations. Kyoto transformed from a refined capital into a devastated battleground. Entire districts burned, families fled. Temples that had stood for centuries became shadows of their former selves. The air that once carried the scents of incense and blossoms filled instead with ash. The saddest irony of the Onin War was how unclear its goals became. Many involved fought simply to avoid losing face or advantage. The reasons that sparked the conflict faded into the background, overshadowed by the momentum of destruction. Warriors battled not for grand ideals, but for survival, honor, and the territories they called home. Even amid this devastation, glimpses of Heian refinement remained. Some courtiers continued writing poetry, as if insisting that beauty must endure even in the midst of ruin. When the Onin War finally ended in 1477, there was no triumphant leader, no clear victor standing proudly over the archipelago. Instead, the war left Japan fractured, exhausted, and deeply altered. The Ashikaga Shogunate survived in name, but its authority had evaporated. The imperial court had no power to restore order. Regional warlords emerged stronger than ever, their territories fortified, their ambitions sharpened. Out of the ashes of Kyoto rose a new Japan, one defined not by central authority but by the will of dozens of daimyo, each ruling over their domains with armies of samurai ready to defend or expand their lands. The country had entered a period of fragmentation so profound that even seasoned historians look upon it with a mix of awe and disbelief. This new era, born from the dissolution of Muromachi power, would come to be known as the Sengoku Period, the Age of Warring States. It was a time when battles reshaped the land, alliances were forged and broken with dizzying speed, and leaders rose and fell like waves. But it was also a time of extraordinary evolution, where innovation, strategy, and resilience guided Japan toward a new form of unity. As we leave the Muromachi era, we step out of a world where culture blossomed in refined stillness, even as political balance fractured beneath the surface. The shogunate's gentle glow fades behind us, while ahead the horizon begins to flicker with sparks of conflict and ambition. Gently, inevitably, the story carries us forward into an age of turmoil, courage, and transformation. Next comes the Sengoku period, where the land itself becomes a battlefield of destiny. The Sengoku Age and the Quest for Unification, 1467 to 1600 CE. When the smoke of the Onin War finally drifted away from Kyoto's battered streets, the city stood like a once grand painting left out in the rain. Its structures were cracked, its cultural jewels scattered, and its authority fractured beyond recognition. There was no single voice left, strong enough to guide the nation. The capital, once the elegant heart of Japan, had become a silent witness to a world shifting beneath its feet. And yet, even in this twilight, new forces were awakening across the archipelago, preparing to shape the destiny of the land in ways few could have imagined. The Sengoku period began not with a proclamation, but with absence. The absence of central leadership, the absence of order, and the absence of anything resembling political stability. Into this void stepped dozens of daimyo, regional lords, whose strength had grown steadily, while Kyoto weakened. With their own armies, resources, and ambitions, these lords began governing as they saw fit, each convinced that they could protect, expand, or elevate their lands. Some ruled with surprising fairness, others with sharp edges, but all operated under the unspoken understanding that new alliances and conflicts could rise as swiftly as morning mist. In this world of shifting power, samurai found themselves navigating unfamiliar currents. Their loyalty, once tied firmly to a clear hierarchy, now followed the fortunes of regional lords. A warrior might serve one leader for years before circumstances required him to swear allegiance to another. Honor remained crucial, but now it was entangled with survival, opportunity, and the unpredictable nature of the age. The battlefield replaced the court as the stage upon which reputations were built. The landscape of Japan transformed as well. Castles rose across valleys and mountainsides, their walls and watchtowers shaping skylines once dominated only by forests and fields. These fortresses were not merely military structures. They became administrative centers, symbols of power, and the beating hearts of each domain. Surrounding towns often grew into bustling hubs of trade, as merchants found new opportunities, supplying armies with food, weapons, fabric, horses, and seemingly endless amounts of patience. Despite the constant risk of conflict, the Sengoku age crackled with vitality. Innovation thrived. Leaders experimented with new strategies, new formations, new ways of organizing armies. Diplomacy, too, evolved into an intricate art of negotiation, deception, and seasonal alliances. At times, a daimyo might send gifts, arrange marriages, or write letters with the gentleness of a poet, only to ride into battle against the same ally months later. It was a time where trust was precious and extremely hard to keep. Yet amid this elegant chaos, three extraordinary figures began to rise, though not all at once. Their lives overlapped only loosely, but together, like three strokes of a brush, they painted the path toward national unification. The first was Oda Nobunaga, a leader whose vision shimmered far beyond the horizons of his rivals. He saw Japan not as a patchwork of territories, but as a single, coherent realm waiting to be shaped. Nobunaga acted swiftly, boldly, and with a strategic brilliance that startled his enemies. He embraced innovation without hesitation, adopting new weapons and tactics that transformed the battlefield. Under his command, firearms became tools not of chaos but of orchestration, woven into battle plans with surprising discipline. Nobunaga moved like a storm across central Japan, breaking long-standing alliances and defeating powerful rivals. His ambition was unmistakable, and while his methods were sometimes severe, they carved open the possibilities of a unified nation. Even Kyoto, weary from centuries of conflict, felt a flicker of hope as Nobunaga restored some measure of stability. But his ascent, brilliant as it was, ended abruptly due to betrayal from within his own circle. His dream, however, did not end with him. Into the void, Nobunaga stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man whose origins were humble enough to inspire storytellers for centuries. Hideyoshi had risen through Nobunaga's ranks through sheer talent, charisma, and a determination that glowed with warmth rather than fire. Where Nobunaga had been sharp and relentless, Hideyoshi was soft-spoken, adaptable, and astonishingly skilled at bringing people together. His diplomacy could feel almost magical, coaxing cooperation from rivals who had spent decades sharpening their disagreements. Under Hideyoshi's leadership, Japan moved closer than ever to unity. Territories once divided by generations of distrust began aligning with his authority. He introduced reforms to stabilize the countryside, organized land surveys to clarify taxation, and attempted to freeze social mobility to ensure order. His efforts bound the nation with layers of administrative and political structure, even as old tensions flickered beneath the surface. By the time Hideyoshi reached the height of his power, Japan had nearly achieved full unification. Only a few regions remained unsettled, and though Hideyoshi launched ambitious campaigns abroad late in his life, the real transformation lay at home, where he brought peace to a land that had known generations of war. When Hideyoshi passed, he left behind a delicate balance that required careful stewardship. Yet the person entrusted with maintaining this balance was still a child, far too young to navigate the ambitions of warrior leaders who had weathered decades of conflict. And so, the archipelago, still warm from the heat of unification, began cooling once more into uncertainty. This is where the third great figure stepped onto the stage, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, calculating, and deeply observant, he had served under both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, learning from their strengths and their mistakes. He moved not with the thunder of Nobunaga, nor the charm of Hideyoshi, but with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that power gained slowly could endure. Ieyasu forged alliances with remarkable care. He waited, watched, and prepared until the moment arrived in 1600, when the great battle of Sekigahara determined the fate of the nation. In a single decisive victory, Ieyasu secured his position as the most powerful leader in Japan. The Sengoku period, with all its chaos, creativity, and shifting loyalties, finally reached its close. But even as the battlefield fell silent, the land carried the memory of its long struggle. Villages rebuilt, castles solidified, warriors adjusted to a world where their swords would soon be symbols of status rather than instruments of daily duty. The archipelago exhaled, as if relieved that its turbulent storm had finally passed. As we step out of the Sengoku age, we leave behind a landscape shaped by ambition, strategy, and resilience. Ahead lies a new era, one defined not by constant warfare, but by remarkable stability. And so, softly and surely, we drift forward into the Tokugawa era, where Japan discovers what peace can build when given time to breathe. Top of form, bottom of form, bottom of form, top of form. The Tokugawa peace and the quiet forge of samurai identity. 1600 to 1868 CE. When the last echoes of Sekigahara faded into the folds of the mountains, it felt as though the land itself finally allowed its shoulders to relax. After more than a century of ceaseless conflict, Japan stepped into an unfamiliar sensation, one so rare that it almost felt fragile to touch. Peace. The kind of peace that stretches across generations, settles into the soil, and reshapes the heartbeat of an entire nation. At the center of this calming transformation stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, whose steady hand led Japan into an age of remarkable stability. Ieyasu moved his government to Edo, a city that at the time was humble compared to Kyoto's polished elegance. Yet Edo carried a quiet promise. Surrounded by water and open land, it waited like a blank canvas, ready to become whatever the new era required. Under Tokugawa leadership, Edo blossomed. Roads, canals, and neighborhoods emerged with determined rhythm. Merchants filled the streets with chatter. Artisans shaped wood, metal, and silk into goods that would eventually define entire cultural movements. Bit by bit, Edo transformed into one of the largest, liveliest cities in the world. The Tokugawa Shogunate established a system known for its clarity, structure, and surprising patience. Power flowed from the shogun through a hierarchy of daimyo who governed their own domains but remained carefully monitored. It was a political arrangement that resembled a calm pond, still at the surface, but supported by an intricate network beneath. To maintain balance, the shogunate required daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo. Their families were encouraged, some might say gently but firmly, to reside in the capital full-time. This created a system of shared presence that knitted the nation together through movement, obligation, and the subtle pressure of proximity. These policies brought stability, but they also reshaped the very nature of samurai life. Warriors who had once trained for battle now found themselves serving as administrators, teachers, scribes, and stewards of their communities. Their swords remained at their sides, gleaming with symbolic importance, yet most days passed without a single clash. Peace had turned the warrior's world into something quieter, almost contemplative. This shift gave rise to a profound internal evolution. Samurai, no longer defined solely by conflict, began shaping a philosophy rooted in discipline, self-cultivation, and ethical conduct. Their code emphasized loyalty, sincerity, and an unwavering commitment to duty. The sword, once an instrument of battle, now embodied honor, responsibility, and inner strength. Samurai trained not only in martial skills, but in reading, writing, poetry, history, and other arts that shaped both mind and spirit. It was during this long, peaceful era that the essence of their identity matured into something deeply reflective. Meanwhile, Edo culture flourished. The city's vibrancy seemed to hum through every street, market, and theater. The merchant class, though officially low in status, gained influence through economic skill, becoming the quiet engines of urban prosperity. With wealth came entertainment districts, tea houses, and artistic movements that blended elegance with a touch of mischief. Kabuki theater dazzled audiences with dramatic gestures and brilliant costumes. Woodblock printing captured everything from landscapes to everyday life, making art accessible to nearly anyone with a few coins to spare. In contrast, Kyoto continued nurturing a world of tradition and refinement. tea masters perfected their craft, treating each movement as a philosophy in motion. Garden designers shaped spaces where moss, stone, and water whispered ancient lessons. Poets wandered temple grounds, capturing the unspoken poetry of passing seasons. The contrast between Edo's lively pulse and Kyoto's refined calm created a cultural dialogue that enriched the entire archipelago. Across the countryside, farmers and villagers settled into predictable rhythms. Rice fields shimmered beneath the sun. Festivals brightened seasons with laughter and ritual. Roads built by the shogunate connected communities, allowing ideas, goods, and stories to travel more freely than ever before. For many, life in the Tokugawa period felt like a long, steady breath after an age of storms. Yet beneath this long peace, subtle tensions gathered, as quiet as clouds forming far on the horizon. Isolationist policies, intended to preserve stability, increasingly limited Japan's exposure to the evolving world. Foreign ships appearing occasionally along coastlines hinted at change approaching from across the sea. Some within Japan admired the simplicity of isolation. Others sensed that peace built on stillness could not last forever if the world around it continued to move. The samurai class, once the backbone of military power, faced their own challenges. Many served faithfully as administrators, teachers, and scholars, but their stipends strained as the economy shifted. Merchants grew wealthier while samurai incomes remained fixed, creating an imbalance that gnawed quietly at society. Some warriors adapted, embracing scholarship and new trades. Others struggled, caught between the dignity of their role and the realities of financial hardship. Despite these changes, the Tokugawa era continued producing extraordinary cultural refinement. Philosophy blossomed through quiet study. Martial arts were codified into organized schools, each emphasizing discipline and self-control. Literature captured both the humor and sorrow of everyday life. In every corner of Japan, from bustling Edo to serene mountain temples, the spirit of harmony flowed through society. But history, like the tide, eventually moves on. By the mid-19th century, the world had grown restless beyond Japan's shores. Western nations sought trade and influence, technologies advanced, ideas traveled faster than ships, and in 1853, when foreign vessels arrived with demands that cracked open Japan's isolation, the old balance began to tremble. Debate surged among samurai, courtiers, and scholars. Some argued for preservation, others urged transformation, and all sensed that the long Tokugawa peace was reaching its final twilight. We're left standing at the shoreline of an enormous historical shift. Behind us lies an age of discipline, tranquility, and orderly stability. Ahead lies an era of upheaval, change, and reinvention, one that will reshape the very essence of Japan. Quietly, gently, we drift toward the next turning point, the fall of the shogunate and the dawn of a new modern age. The Meiji transformation and the gentle sunset of the samurai, 1868 and beyond. By the time the 19th century reached its midpoint, Japan had grown so accustomed to the long Tokugawa peace that change felt almost like a foreign visitor, knocking softly at the door. Life had settled into an orderly rhythm. Edo pulsed with merchants and craftsmen, Kyoto hummed with ancient refinement, and countless villages drifted through the seasons like petals upon a calm stream. For generations, the samurai had lived as guardians of this tranquility, their swords gleaming not from battle but from careful polishing. Yet beneath this serene surface, the world outside was shifting so quickly that even the most patient mountain would have raised an eyebrow, had mountains possessed eyebrows. The arrival of foreign ships, vast dark silhouettes rising from the fog like steel-backed whales, brought a shock that rippled across the archipelago. It wasn't just the cannons or the unfamiliar flags that unsettled Japan. It was the undeniable message they carried. The world had changed, and Japan could no longer look away. Steam power, industrial might, and the expanding ambitions of global empires pressed upon the nation's consciousness with the insistence of a tide that refused to recede. Within Japan, debates unfolded like storm clouds gathering over distant fields. Scholars argued late into the night, their discussions illuminated by lantern light and the occasional exasperated sigh. Samurai officials paced quiet hallways, weighing tradition against necessity. Some believed Japan must hold tightly to its old ways, guarding its culture like a precious scroll. Others insisted that only through adaptation could the country protect its identity in a rapidly transforming world. The air grew thick with questions, with uncertainty, with possibility. It was within this atmosphere of tension and awakening that the Meiji Restoration emerged in 1868. Despite the name, this was less a return to old rule and more a leap toward an entirely new future. Power shifted from the Tokugawa Shogunate to the emperor, but the true force behind the transformation was a rising group of young leaders, many of them samurai, who saw modernization not as betrayal but as survival. Their vision was bold. They aimed not to imitate the West, but to learn selectively, to blend new ideas with ancient values until Japan could stand on its own terms in the world. The changes that followed came swiftly, almost breathlessly. Railroads stretched across the land like iron calligraphy. Telegraph lines hummed with signals that leapt across distances once measured in days. Factories rose with chimneys that exhaled steady streams of ambition. Schools opened their doors to children from all social classes, teaching reading and arithmetic alongside glimpses of a wider world. It was as if Japan had suddenly awoken from a centuries-long meditation and decided to stretch, breathe deeply, and step forward with purpose. But for the samurai, the transformation brought a bittersweet turning of the tide. Their role, once central to the nation's stability, began to shift into something quieter, less defined. Stipends that had supported their households were gradually dissolved. The wearing of swords in public, once a mark of dignity, grew restricted. Military reforms introduced conscription, replacing centuries of warrior lineage with a national army. Titles, traditions, and privileges that had shaped their lives for generations began slipping away, as gently as dusk, smoothing the edges of a day. For many samurai, this transition felt like standing at the edge of a familiar forest, watching the trees rearrange themselves into shapes they did not recognize. Some adapted quickly. They became scholars, teachers, engineers, administrators, entrepreneurs. Their discipline and literacy helped fuel Japan's modernization. Others struggled to find footing, caught between a past that no longer existed and a future not yet ready to receive them. A few resisted, unable to let go of the world they had sworn to protect. Yet even as swords were sheathed for the last time, something in the samurai spirit refused to fade. It lingered in the quiet commitment to one's craft, whether that craft was farming, writing, engineering, or leadership. It echoed in the way communities supported one another through change. It shimmered in the national determination to grow strong without losing sight of deeper values. The warrior identity, once embodied in armor and steel, began to live instead in discipline of mind, clarity of purpose, and integrity of heart. Meanwhile, the Japanese people found themselves navigating a remarkable transformation. Villages rebuilt themselves around new roads and new industries. Cities expanded in dazzling bursts of energy. Students traveled abroad, returning with knowledge that opened new possibilities. Steamships connected Japan to the world in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. The archipelago, once isolated by deliberate choice, now sent its voices, its ambitions, and its innovations rippling outward across oceans. And still, in the midst of this momentum, Japan carried its history softly within itself, in a tea house where steam curled from a ceramic bowl, in a calligraphy stroke that captured emotion in a single breath, in a garden where stones and moss held conversations older than dynasties. The past whispered not to restrain the future, but to steady it, reminding each generation that identity is not a single form, but a living thread woven through time. By the late 19th century, Japan had transformed into a modern nation-state, confident enough to negotiate with global powers and visionary enough to shape its own path. The emperor symbolized renewal. The government pushed forward reforms, the people adapted with resilience and creativity, and through it all, the quiet soul of the samurai, stripped of titles and weapons, became something more universal, more internal, more enduring. If one looks across the arc of Japan's history, from the first sparks of life on its prehistoric shores, to the formation of early states, to the poetry-filled palaces of Heian Period, to the battles of medieval warlords, to the unification under Tokugawa rule, and finally to the Meiji reawakening, one sees a story not driven by conflict alone, nor by beauty alone, but by a constant interplay between change and continuity, between what must evolve and what must be remembered, between letting go and holding fast. In the gentle twilight of this long narrative, imagine standing at the edge of a quiet hill overlooking modern Japan. Lights flicker in distant cities, trains glide through the landscape like threads weaving the present. Mountains rise in ancient silhouettes, indifferent to centuries, yet guardians to them all. And somewhere in that vastness, the echo of a samurai's footsteps lingers, not as a reminder of warfare, but as a reminder of intention, of clarity, of a life lived with purpose, even as the world reshapes itself. For the samurai spirit was never truly about the sword. It was about the person who carried it. And so we end where all great journeys end, not at a conclusion, but at a threshold. Because history is not a closed gate, but a long, winding path of memory and renewal. Japan's story, like all stories, continues to breathe, continues to unfold, continues to wait for new voices to join its telling. If you listen closely in the stillness between moments, you can hear it. The past exhaling, the future inhaling, and the present balancing gently between the two like a leaf floating on a quiet stream, moving steadily forward into the next chapter of its own becoming. Bottom of form,